Hello, and thank you for joining us on the Freedom from the Struggle podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Corelli. I'd like to welcome you to Season 2, Episode 11. And this episode is going to be quite different than any of the previous episodes we've done in Season 2. You see, I've decided to give a platform to somebody who I would normally not give a platform to. This person wrote in a pretty aggressive letter, what I believe is in an effort to mock us or to provoke us. But towards the bottom of the letter, there were some questions. And I thought to myself, these might be questions that other people who stumble upon this podcast may also have regarding the things we talk about here. So rather than ignore this letter completely, I thought I would cut it up a little bit and we would go through these questions in an effort to maybe even satisfy some answers that believers have about these specific topics. So we'll jump into that letter in just a minute. But what I wanted to do is take a little bit of time to tell you about some exciting things we have going on here at Freedom from the Struggle and the Struggle series. Many of you know that I am the author of a little trilogy of books called the Struggle series. And books 1 and 2 are out. Most of them, those books are out in bookstores where you would find books. And The Struggle was actually the first book, and that was released in 2019. The Sacrifice was released shortly after that, a couple years later. And those books are basically a hybrid of horror novels, Christian novels, and detective novels. I always say that they're horror detective novels written with a gospel message. And so, for those of you who have not heard those books, but maybe times are tough or you're not somebody who normally reads books, we've decided to release books 1 and 2 over the next coming weeks in a separate podcast format. So these are not audiobooks. You could find them in podcast format in the same places that you would listen to this podcast. And each chapter will be an episode. Right now, you can go to what is, and I'll give you that address in just a second. But right now, you can listen to actually a couple of chapters of The Struggle because we're releasing them a chapter every day, every other day until that book is complete. And then we'll begin to work on book 2. But you can find those books on The Struggle colon book 1 hyphen The Struggle series. That's where you can find book 1. So it's The Struggle colon book 1 hyphen The Struggle series. And I'm giving you that because there's so many things on podcast formats that are entitled The Struggle. So it's going to take you a little while to find it. I didn't want to change the name of it because that's the name of the book. But once you dig through it and set it to follow and to give you notifications, anytime a new chapter is released, you can just get that automatically and listen to it at your leisure. So if you have a few moments and you'd like to check it out, like I said, book 1, The Struggle, has a couple chapters that are already released. So you can check that out. And as we get into book 2, I'll give you that information as well. Without any further ado, I want to jump into this letter because this episode has the potential to get long and I don't want it to do so. But let me give you the information on a letter from Intellectually Superior. And this actually is addressed from somebody calling themselves intellectually superior. They did not give their name. I am not sure if this is a woman or a man. Some of the language would possibly indicate that this is a man, so you may hear me call him, but I'm not really sure. So let's try to just keep this, in terms of it, we don't know who it is. And I'm going to cut up quite a bit of the letter, but I'm going to read you the introduction. And it starts here. I am writing because I've listened to your podcast and I think you are in error in terms of your beliefs. Wow. I didn't know that we can just get right to it like that. But It says this: I'm not sure of your educational background, if you have any, but I thought I would let you know that I think you need to rethink your position on this whole Sky Daddy thing. It is the year 2024, and it's time that we move past the fairy tale known as Jesus. Now, let's talk about this for a minute. If I wanted to actually debate with somebody, or if I really was concerned about somebody's beliefs being in error, I don't really think I would come out this hot, if you know what I'm saying. I think it's important to know that this person wants to pick a fight or just considers themselves, as it's titled, intellectually superior. Now, I'm going to get into some of this in the first question, but my background doesn't just come from ministry. I'm also a doctorally educated psychology person. I have studied psychology for many, many years. And so I understand what not only the passive aggressive nature, but I'm going to say the narcissistic nature of the beginning of this letter. In my career, not only as a therapist, but also sometimes as a minister, sometimes when you get close to what people don't want you to know, there's this little mechanism where they try to discredit you. And one of the ways that I have heard directed towards me on countless occasions is, what's your educational background? Where did you go to college? And what it is it's a method to say that they're smarter than you, or you're not smart enough to address the topic that you're dealing with. And people don't usually say that unless you're right over the target, if you know what I mean. So this person is questioning my educational background, and I'll get to that in a second. And when you know that right out of the gate, you know that this person, the narcissism comes from an insecurity. So they're trying to already establish dominance over me. And what's funny is I technically could have chosen to just not read this letter because trust me, we have several like this. The only reason I'm reading it is because this person actually had the common sense maybe to at least try to ask some questions, even though the questions are derogatory in and of themselves. So I'm going to skip through a whole bunch of attacks in the letter, and I'm going to get to about a three quarters of the way down. And it says, I have a few questions that I hope you would answer for your audience. So I'm not answering it for this person. I'm answering it for the audience, which again is an attempt to show the audience how stupid I am, apparently. So the first question: what is your educational professional background? Well, my educational background is pretty extensive. I am a PhD in counseling psychology, a bunch of undergrad and master's degrees. I'm an ordained minister, and I'm not going to go into details about that because I am definitely not trying to brag or tell everybody how great I am. That means nothing to me. I was a licensed therapist as well as an ordained minister with lots of educational background. And if it helps you, I've gone to college about 13 and a half, almost 14 years after high school. So that's probably somebody with a little bit of education. If the person was trying to establish that I wasn't educated and then maybe I just am some Christian who decided to get a podcast. With that being said, I also don't profess to be the smartest guy in the world. There's many other people, not only in ministry, but also in therapy, who are way smarter and way more qualified than me. But I'm not somebody who just fell off the therapy truck or had my first job in ministry 5 minutes ago, if that helps. Question two: what qualifies you to consider yourself an expert in this field? Well, I'm assuming he means the field, or she means the field of deliverance ministry, or at least the topics that we cover here. And again, I don't claim to be the foremost expert, but I have studied the subject of deliverance, and I've also studied the subjects of deliverance versus psychopathology. And I've been working with deliverance ministry since I was 16. I actually performed my first deliverance prayers over somebody at age 16. I've worked in the ministry in several capacities, from preacher to worship leader to uh, basically overseeing other preachers, a lot of different ministries, including adult education about the Bible, about a little topic called apologetics, which is how to contend for your faith or, debate over faith. So I have some background in that. But as far as deliverance goes, I've been praying deliverance since I was 16 years old, even before I was even a lay minister, let alone a vocational minister. I've also worked with a wide range of clients suffering from many mental health disorders. And so, one of the things I've done in my career is help people who are performing deliverance by doing mental health assessments on people before deliverance ministry is performed on severe cases. So I have had other pastors reach out to me and say, "Would you meet with this person and maybe even do some testing to see if you see any psychopathology?" So, if that kind of answers your question, I am somebody who understands mental health in a pretty big way. One of my specialties throughout my career as a therapist was working with people with massive psychopathology, personality disorders, etc. So I know how to do differential diagnosis to make sure that it's not drug abuse or schizophrenia that's causing people to hallucinate. And I'll be honest with you, many of the people I've worked with who claim they need deliverance ministry had some mental health issues. And even then, sometimes it's a kind of a combination of both demonic influence and mental health, kind of like a chicken and the egg type thing. But sometimes a demon can use a mental health disorder as a way in. And then some people would argue and say the mental health disorder came after the demon came in. And regardless of that, there are ways that you treat people. And I always ask a ton of questions before I actually perform an in person deliverance session, if that helps. Question three: what evidence outside of the Bible do you have that Jesus even existed? I've actually had this question a lot lately. So I'm assuming that there is some source out there that is telling people that Jesus didn't exist and that they're all studying the same documents or the same teaching, because I've heard this, I think, 4 times, including this letter, in the last month. So there must be some sort of teaching that people are participating in that is telling them that Jesus didn't exist. Now, let me kind of go over this quickly but thoroughly, because again, this podcast could be 2 hours if I let it. There was a man named Flavius Josephus who was a Roman Jewish historian, a scholar, and he wrote a lot about the times of first century Roman Jewish uh, culture and what was going on at that time. Now, Josephus was not a Christian or what was considered the way at that time. They weren't called Christians until Antioch. So most of the Jewish teachers and professional religious people of the day called them the way. But Josephus was not a part of that, yet he knew about it. And probably about 93, 94 AD, Josephus wrote about Jesus. He also wrote about John the Baptist. So keep in mind that Josephus is hearing people talk and understanding what they are saying. He spoke of the crucifixion. And this is, just keep in mind 60 years, give or take, from when the crucifixion happened. He called Jesus a wise man. He said he did miracles. So he knew of this man, probably by word of mouth. Some people say he might have actually been a witness to some of this, not really sure about that, but he knew of him. Now, One of the arguments that people would have is to say, well, this was not written when it was happening. Well, let me give you some perspective. It's 2024 as we record this. 60 years ago would have been 1964. Some of you listeners were actually born in 1964. You were alive. I wasn't. I was born in the early 70s, but my mother was in her teens in 64. So she could tell me all about what it was like in 1964. More than that, I can actually get on my television and find television programs from 1964. I can also ask grandparents, other friends of the family, other uncles, aunts, and they could give me a pretty accurate depiction of what was going on in 1964. So, right about that time, John F. Kennedy was being assassinated. And how much information do we have about John F. Kennedy? And although there's a huge conspiracy about who actually killed John F. Kennedy, maybe the CIA did it, maybe the mafia did it, maybe it was Lee Harvey Oswald that did it. But one thing we do know for sure, 60 years later, we have a ton of information on that assassination, don't we? So 60 years after the events is not far enough to distort the facts of the case to where it is completely false. More importantly, we absolutely know that there was a man named John F. Kennedy who was assassinated. You see what I'm getting at? You can't say that because he didn't write it exactly the day after it happened, it's not accurate. And more importantly, you definitely can't say that Jesus didn't exist. Why would this man who is not a Christian, who would not be interested in the propaganda, even write this? Now, there's another Roman historian who is definitely not involved in this religious movement in any way by the name of Tacitus. And in a similar time frame, he wrote about the crucifixion of Jesus as well. So stop and think for a second. What evidence do we have outside the Bible that Jesus existed? These are two people who are not Christians, yet wrote about the same events within a very short period of time from the actual events themselves. If that is not enough information for you, nothing will to answer that specific question. The question isn't, was Jesus the Son of God? The question was, did he exist at all? And you would have enough evidence there to win in court, no problem. Let's go to question 4. And and I want you to hear the wording of this question, which again is very antagonistic. You arrogantly speak of the Bible as an authoritative book. What evidence do you have that the Bible is real and not just a bunch of stories that people put together throughout history? Wow. I'm arrogant, I guess. I guess I'm the only one who professes the Bible to be authoritative. There's only billions of people that believe it. But let's start with this. The Bible as an authoritative book has to do a lot with what it professes, and who wrote it. Well, it says, what evidence do you have that the Bible is real? Well, let's take the New Testament. Most scholars state that the epistles of Paul, so the books that Paul wrote, are dated back to about 50 to 60 AD. So give or take 20 years after the death of Jesus. Now, that is even closer than what Josephus and Tacitus wrote by far. Some people actually say that the book of Galatians was written in 48 AD, which means this man, Paul, who was a persecutor, actually a murderer of Christians, commissioned the murder of Christians, had to have a moment where he was transformed by having an interaction with God, transformed his whole life, began his ministry, walking throughout this entire region, a large surface area on the map. and then was being persecuted to where he was writing letters to these churches that he had founded to keep them in track. So writing a letter in 48 AD means that he had already established a relationship with these people. So if you're looking at the very short, what you're talking within 20 years, he's writing these letters. Paul was beheaded for his beliefs. Most of the apostles were tortured, beaten and killed in horrendous ways for their beliefs. So if you want to believe these are a bunch of stories that these crazy men put together, would you die for what you believe in if it wasn't true? You think how crazy of a concept that is. But the Bible is a real book. It's not just a bunch of stories that people put together because it's establishing a narrative of this man named Jesus and how he commissioned these people to change the world. And I'm going to give you like a crazy example that maybe some of you haven't considered. Nobody that you will ever meet will doubt that Plato exists, right? But we believe that he lived about 400 BC, give or take. He was born a little bit before that, died a little bit after that. But we only have small fragments of papyrus from the 2nd and 3rd century AD about his writings in terms of what would be considered original manuscripts. So a lot of the writings of Plato are actually copies of copies of copies of copies, but nobody doubts that these are the words of Plato, even though the oldest manuscripts that you have are fragments of papyrus from the 2nd and 3rd century, which means that the full manuscripts are much older. If you think about the 27 books of the New Testament, most scholars would tell you that these books were written within the 1st century. Some of the manuscripts, may be older in terms of within the 2nd century, but the books to be copied from copies, even into the 2nd century, is way older. Now, if you think there's about 5,800 Greek manuscripts, which the New Testament was written in, if you think about the 10,000 Latin transcripts when the Bible was translated to Latin in what's called the Vulgate, and then 9,300 other transcripts from other languages. Now, why is that important? Well, because there's a concept called conjectural emendation. And my best example of that would be the Wheel of Fortune. What conjectural emendation means is that with the information you have, you can piece together anything that you're missing. So if you have a puzzle on the Wheel of Fortune and you have some of the letters, you have enough to solve the puzzle, even though you don't have the entire puzzle turned over for you to just read. Wheel of Fortune is just a fancy game of hangman. And I actually love Wheel of Fortune. I'm very good at it. My kids hate to watch Wheel of Fortune with me because I usually can beat them. And I say that because I understood this concept of conjectural emendation when it was taught to me many years ago in seminary, is that I don't need to have the original manuscript match the next manuscript if there's an error. It doesn't discount the original. So let's say, for example, somebody misspelled the word, or let's say they misused a word. For those of us who can speak other languages, we realize that English is a very complicated, weird language, and it's actually very hard to learn for people who aren't from here. And I'm saying that because I'm going to give you an example. Let's take the word break. What does break mean? You see how that causes you to pause because you're contemplating whether it's the word B-R-A-K-E or B-R-E-A-K. So B-R-A-K-E means to stop, or the mechanism that you use to stop. B-R-E-A-K means that you can snap something in half, or You need a rest in between lunch and your next session at work. So if somebody accidentally used the wrong word break, but you were reading the information and you took that word out or understood that they wrote the wrong word, you'd still know what it meant. More importantly, there are so many manuscripts that if you see what you consider is an error, you can go to another manuscript. And if they left out a letter, you can piece together what the message was. So if you are somebody who believes that there's not enough manuscripts of the New Testament to say that it's real or hasn't been altered, you're not educated. You believe in a lot of things that you have much less proof of than whether the New Testament is real. The Old Testament, we can get into a lot of that. But, just keep in mind, many people thought that the book of Daniel had to have been written after these things in history occurred because there's no way it could be that accurate. And then, of course, when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls and found ancient manuscripts of Isaiah and Daniel, they realized that these prophecies were fulfilled. And, you'll find people who want to use things that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls as evidence against the Bible, but you won't hear those same people talking about the massive amount of evidence for the Bible being authentic because you have scientists who have a bias towards proving Christianity isn't true, not the fact that maybe their null hypothesis wasn't met. But we'll stay out of that. But we are going to talk about statistics because I want to give you this idea as I kind of wrap up this question. For those people who don't believe that the Bible is true, but they are science people, they believe in science, this is something that you should consider. The Bible has a ton of prophecies, hundreds of prophecies about who the Messiah would be. But most scholars would believe that there's actually 48 prophecies that would say that this is the Messiah. Okay. So I want you to think about like what it would take for somebody to just fulfill 15 of them. That is actually 1 in 10 to the 80th power. And even some statisticians have lowered that down to 1 in 10 to the 62.5 power. So 10 with 62 and a half zeros. I don't know what that number's called. I don't think there is a number, but that's huge. But for somebody to fulfill all 48 prophecies, it's about 1 in 10 to the 157th power. And somebody worked it like this, so that would make sense to people who don't understand statistics. That's the equivalent of winning the lottery 22 times in a row. It's impossible for Jesus to have fulfilled these prophecies that were written hundreds and spoken of thousands of years before Jesus was even born. And so you think of somebody writing a prophecy down, whether it was false or true, and not just, somebody's going to be born, they're going to be a man, they're going to have black hair, and they're going to have eyebrows. I'm talking crazy things like, well, he's going to be born from Bethlehem, but he's going to be called a Nazarene, but he's going to come out of Egypt. See, people of the day would have said, this doesn't make any sense. These are contradictory. But if a baby was born in Bethlehem and there was an evil king trying to kill him, so his family fled to Egypt, and when it was safe, they came back and settled in Nazareth, then that person has now fulfilled those 3 prophecies in a way that people wouldn't have considered at the time, etc. So again, hopefully that helps a little bit. Now, the next question from this person says, what are your thoughts on science? I actually love science. Science was my favorite subject in high school by far. Loved it. But I've adopted a saying, and this might tick some of you off, but I'm not really concerned about your feelings at this point because we're talking about science, right? There is no feelings. But this phrase I want you to hear me say as loud and clear is science is not an exact science. Science is constantly changing. I'm gonna kind of give you a recent example to make sure I make some of you really mad. Science told me in 2020 that if I don't take a vaccine, I'm going to pass on this virus to all of these people. Now, whether you took a vaccine or not, I don't really care. It was your choice, but they made it to where it wasn't really a choice. And what's crazy is that people started putting out information saying that this thing might cause something like myocarditis, where younger people were having heart problems, etc. And those people were labeled conspiracy theorists. Yet, very recently, Dr. Fauci himself, the Messiah, said that there is evidence that the vaccines can contribute to myocarditis in people that aren't normally considered at risk for that. So the conspiracy became the truth, but that didn't get broadcast the same as the original topics where people were being attacked for being conspiracy theorists. So science changed just within about 3 years. So people who want to put all of their eggs in the basket of science have to remember that once upon a time, a guy told the world that the earth wasn't stationary, that the earth actually revolved around the sun, and he was persecuted for it. But now that's considered normal, obvious information because science did some calculations and science changed. It wasn't that long ago where bloodletting and leeches were a way to cure diseases, but we don't do that anymore. So when people want to challenge me with science, what they're saying is that science is contradictory to the Bible, which isn't really true. And more importantly, a lot of the things that they talk about are archaeological carbon dating stuff, but I don't know if you realize just how unreliable carbon dating and radon radioactive dating is because things change. And I'll give you some examples, and I'm trying to answer these off the top of my head. So if I missed some numbers, these are just things I've taught over the years that I'm kind of remembering. So I'll ask for some forgiveness if I misquote a number, but I think the information should be pretty accurate. So you can go to a Google search if you don't believe me, but I think it's about 40,000 to 60,000 years is what they would consider pretty accurate for carbon dating because then the half-lives get too small. So how are we dating things back to 600 million years ago? They have to be guesses. As a matter of fact, even within that time frame of 40,000 years or so, there's still an error rate of 2 or 5%. Well, that's not that big of a deal. Well, look, it's a huge deal because you're making statements based off of information that is obviously not 100% accurate, but most of them are speaking as if it is. And, how do we test it? You and I, the normal layperson who, and maybe this person who is intellectually superior has this level of education and background, but I'm telling you, they couldn't prove it 100%. They couldn't bet their life on it. They would just say that that's what the science says or that's what the math says. But we couldn't test it. How am I going to disprove it? But here's something to consider. When the moon rocks were first evaluated, they were 3.16 billion years old. And that didn't quite work because they thought that the moon was part of the original, cosmic mess that made up the earth and the debris, flew out into space and then, made its own little body that was in gravity with the earth. But then they retested it and it was 4.4 billion years old. So then that became a little more accurate. Except science in and of itself that banks on the fact that the moon and the earth are approximately the same age, there's things that science can't disprove. Like ancient civilizations that have stories of when the moon wasn't here be- before the moon came. Now, am I saying the moon wasn't always here? No, I'm not saying that. I actually believe the Bible says that there were, you know, stellar bodies put there for us to be able to distinguish night from day and the seasons and such. But there are people that say these things, and maybe there's some truth to it, maybe there's not. We don't know. That's the point. So you have faith in science and mock our faith in God. But our biblical narrative answers a lot of questions that science still hasn't answered. But because somebody somewhere once upon a time made a contentious relationship between science and Christianity, that's now become the norm. But you get many of the scientists of the day, these were people of faith. These weren't people who were considered atheists, if you would. So your faith in science is probably less accurate than the Bible, even though you don't really want to hear that. And of course, you can find 10 things right off the bat that might, create some anxiety in a Christian because they don't have the answer to. But that's arrogant in and of itself because there's a million things you don't know the answer to. And that's what's beautiful about science is that it's constantly evolving. And if science ever comes to a place where it can absolutely disprove God 100%, then you can write this letter and I would have to cower. But because that doesn't exist, not even close. Many of us Christians are still out trying to get this message across about these evil spirits that are trying to torment our lives. I wasn't picking fights with atheists on the internet. I'm just trying to reach people who are struggling, but these people seem to want to challenge us. And I wonder why, but maybe we'll get to that towards the end of this. Let's get to the next question. What are your thoughts on archaeology? And I'm assuming this person hasn't listened to the earlier podcasts when we've talked about this, but I'm actually very intrigued in archaeology. I am um, a student of this, definitely not an expert, but I have studied it a lot because that's one of the reasons I actually believe in the Bible and in God. Because science keeps changing the date of complex civilizations. Anytime there's a new archaeological study, it seems to change the dates. And then, of course, the atheists or the science people say, well, the Bible says that the earth is only 6,000 years old or mankind's only 6,000 years old. But here's Gobekli Tepe in Turkey that says it's about 12,000 years old. And this new civilization is about 15,000 years old. And again, what are we using? Carbon dating? But more importantly, if you want to use that same argument, these were at times where original scientists said that this was the Stone Age, that mankind was using primitive tools like making spears out of rocks and sticks, and yet they're building the 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 what's called the vulture stone at Gobekli Tepe is so intricately carved, and these stones are so huge, we can't even figure out how they were placed, let alone why it was buried. There is um, places in Bolivia and South America that are so intricately designed that we may not even have tools that can cut these rocks, these stones to precision like they were then, let alone lift them and place them. We don't have cranes big enough. How were the pyramids built? So archaeology doesn't account for the fact that on one side of the fence, they said these people were primitive and on the other side of the fence, they were building these structures with technology that we can't duplicate now. There had to be something else. Well, if the argument is we just don't know that these civilizations were advanced, there must have been something. Well, I have the something. I have the something that these angels called the Watchers were sent down from heaven by God to teach mankind things, but they got minds of their own and taught them things they weren't supposed to teach them. They had these hybrid beings when they chose to take, mates for themselves with the human women. and had these beings called the Nephilim who were giants, strong men. Plus, the Watchers had, supernatural powers. They were angels who knew knowledge. They're the ones that taught mankind war and weapons of war that they weren't supposed to teach us. So if they can teach us things like metallurgy to make weapons, you don't think they had the technology to cut stones and levitate them or lift them into these structures? See, that is an answer that science doesn't have. Their answer is we don't know why Gobekli Tepe exists because in this point in history, we basically thought that this was a group of cavemen that were becoming civilized. Yet they built these structures. See, at least we have an answer. One of the things that I absolutely, I guess, get annoyed with and love at the same time is I hear the flood narratives, and I always hear, if you watch the History Channel and such, you hear that the Epic of Gilgamesh is older than the Bible, and therefore their flood story is older, and therefore the Bible writers copied the story from the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this is simple. The Epic of Gilgamesh might have been written before the Bible was written, but there is nothing that indicates that the story was older. Well, yes, there is. What about the Sumerian texts and what about the Anunnaki and these people that were here? Well, how do we date those? With the same dating that is flawed and errored? Well, and more importantly, just because something was written down before doesn't mean it happened. So if I write down some information 40 years after the first person who wrote it down, does that discount the fact that we're talking about the same thing? There are like something like 270 flood myths throughout the globe from different faiths and different civilizations that talk about one giant flood. Now, was there several floods? Was there one flood? And maybe there were several floods, but the one flood all seems to have the same narrative. There was a God that was mad at us. He sent a flood to cleanse the earth. Okay, so if the Sumerians in the Epic of Gilgamesh wrote that, and we wrote about that in the Bible, there's nothing to indicate that it's not the same story being told from a couple different perspectives. And more importantly, if you've listened to some of my previous episodes, you will find that I actually believe that the Bible character Nimrod is Gilgamesh because of who the king of Assyria was and so on and so forth. And you can do your own studies with that. Again, you don't take my word for it. Google it. Was Nimrod Gilgamesh? And there'll be several stories that you can read about that. So you don't have to believe that this uh, uh, uneducated, quote unquote, guy who's just doing this little podcast doesn't know what he's talking about. If intellectually superior wants to do some research, it is very likely that Gilgamesh and Nimrod were the same character in history, not just in the Bible, but in history. And Nimrod became Gilgamesh because of some of this kind of Nephilim type watcher, fallen angel type interactions and rituals that made these people giants because the Bible said there was giants before the flood and after the flood. And that's very complicated. And can go back and listen to previous episodes where we discussed that. Now, that question of archaeology doesn't answer all the questions about is the Bible real or not. As a matter of fact, it probably answers more questions than you want it to. It definitely doesn't disprove it. When you hear the story of Jericho, where these people walked around Jericho with the ark, and there was this big sound that happened, and then the walls blew out, which made kind of a artificial siege ramp where they could run up into the city and overtake the city. Well, that sounds like a fantastic story until archaeology finds that there was this city and that all the rocks from the walls were blown outward, making a siege ramp. What do you do with that? Well, what most atheistic science archaeological type people say is, well, let's not talk about that. Let's talk about this other thing we found that we think disproves the Bible. Okay, well, what about the thing we found? Well, we're not going to talk about that. And even if you say, well, the Bible used a story of this civilization, yeah, but it proves that there was a actual city of Jericho that had the walls blown out and was overtaken. You can't dispute that. And so that's what I think of archaeology. Let's keep going here. Question 8. Why do you need a God? Aren't we evolved enough to cease believing in things we cannot see? Now, this one I almost didn't read because it's so ridiculous. And again, I'm not trying to be facetious and pick a fight with intellectually superior, but there's a part of me that just has to see through some of this. There you might be pretty smart person, but I don't know how intellectually superior you think you are when you write a question like this because you believe in about 80 billion things you can't see. You know, when I used to think like this when I was young, this is how my mind works. I had this book when I was young. It was this big picture book, and it was a picture of like all of these scientific kind of things. And there was a section about astrological or astronomical cosmic um, philosophies and visuals. And when you first opened that section, the first thing you saw was Earth, and it was this blue ball, and it appeared that you were looking at it from space. Now, keep in mind, this is the early, I would, no, let me rephrase that. It was probably mid to late 70s. And as you continued to go, there was these pictures of space, and it was like a far view, and it would show you the sun, and then it would show you the Earth and the other planets. There was the sun, then there was Mercury, then Venus, then Earth, then Mars. And it showed it as if somebody had gone out into space with a wide angle lens in their Buick or something, and then turned around and snapped a picture. But we had only been to the moon, a decade earlier, not even. So what was the moon? 68, 69? Sorry for forgetting that. But we don't know that that picture is accurate because it's not a real picture. This was an artist's rendering and beautiful one. As a kid, my first instinct was it was a real picture, but then my mind, even as a young child, said, "That's not a real picture. That can't be. Who took the picture? What kind of camera do we have that could make it so clear, so unbelievably clear?" And then in my studies, I went back and found pictures of the moon from the Apollo missions. I mean, from the Earth, facing from the moon to the Earth. And these pictures were grainy and it didn't have the whole Earth. They were kind of blurred. And so we believe what we know what the universe looks like. And now there's telescopes and such. But again, those of us lay people, we don't know how much of that is true and how much of that is AI generated and that type of thing. But we believe in many things we can't see. We put our faith in a lot of things, like a chair. Why do you sit in a chair blindly without testing it before you sit in it? Because you've had so many episodes of sitting in a chair, but if somebody's ever pulled the chair out from under you or the chair had some loose screws and when you sat on it, it fell, you trusted in something that you didn't test, that you didn't see. You believe that carbon dioxide is flowing out of your mouth and feeding plants, but you can't see it. Can you? I can't. I wear glasses, so I don't even have enough vision to see without my glasses, let alone to see atomic level particles that are coming out of my mouth. We believe these things because it's what we're told. And if you have studied these things and you understand them, I can find you 50 other things that you don't know. One of the things, and as a therapist, I worked with a lot of people who were having issues with, the law, kind of behavioral issues. And we were asked to do a therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. It's not the foremost cutting edge therapy, but it's usually good for people who you're trying to help them change some behaviors. And one of the things I used to do is draw a big circle on the board, and I would ask them, if this is all the knowledge there is to know, how much do you know? And my goodness, people would say, oh, about a third, oh, half. And I would just, get different color whiteboard markers and you know, fill in the pie of the circle. And then when they were done, I'd draw another circle and then I'd put a dot as small as I could put it. And I'd say, this is what you know. Because in reality, we don't know nothing about nothing. And people who think they know everything were the ones that got upset at my little whiteboard explanation. But I would say, well, you want to challenge me? You know half of all there is to know? Okay, what size bolts are used to bolt in the seats of a Boeing 747? What is the chemical makeup of those bolts in terms of getting up here on the board and drawing the molecular structure of the metal used in those bolts? We don't know nothing. We just think we do. And so people who challenge our faith in God come from a place where they believe they know more. They don't come from a humble place. They come from a very arrogant place. But I believe in the Bible because I am humble enough to know that I'm not smart enough to be God myself. And we'll get to that again in a second. But to answer the question, aren't we evolved enough to cease believing in things we cannot see? I can't speak to your need, but I can't afford not to believe, because I believe in absolute truth. And if there's absolute truth, there has to be an absolute truth giver. And not everything is all relative like the world tells you today. That's actually a very flawed way of thinking. There are absolutes, there has to be. Um, and if people say, well, there are no absolutes, there's no absolute truth, I would just simply ask them, are you absolutely sure? Let that sink in for a second. Because if you're absolutely sure, you just gave me an absolute. And if you're not absolutely sure, why are you fighting with me? You are speaking in absolutes as you're telling me there's no absolutes. Do you see how crazy that is? That's stuff that people who philosophers who think they're smart but don't realize the simplicities of what they're arguing. There are absolutes. And why is that important? Because I'm not going to derive my standards from flawed human beings. I want my standards to come from something above me, something with more morality and omniscience than myself. And no offense to you, intellectually superior, but you're not a kind person. You're very antagonistic and nasty. I don't, I'm not taking my standards from what you think is right or wrong. You don't even have compassion. I'm a flawed person. I've made so many mistakes. You could never expect me to put myself on any sort of pedestal. This podcast exists out of my humility and out of my experiences because I like to get in the mud with people because I've been in that mud. I know how to help them get out of that mud and get their life back together because I've been in that mud. I don't do this because I think I'm smarter than anybody. And I humbly welcome other teachers. I'm continuing to learn to teach me about topics that I'm even talking to you about you today and through this podcast. Because if I'm not teachable, then I'm worthless. And I don't want a bunch of people who believe that they've arrived, but the evidence of their lives is so flawed and so detrimental to human beings to be the person who gives me my standards. It if that makes sense to you, if that hurts your feelings, I'm sorry, but benevolence is a beautiful thing. But if you don't have that and you don't think that that's the right thing, well, what kind of world are we going to live in? I would rather have a God that tells me there's a time for peace and a time for war, not somebody who tells me there's never a time for war or there's never a time for peace. And depending on who you're talking to, you may get one or two of those answers. And more importantly, I'd rather have a God who can tell me through his word and through his teachings when the time is for one and when the time is for other. And I can beat that again to death, but I don't want this to go too long. So let's get to this last question here. Can you acknowledge that the church has been responsible for horrible atrocities throughout history? Well, intellectually superior, I can. Absolutely, you're right. The church, capital C church, has been responsible for some horrible atrocities throughout history. I believe the Crusades were horrible. I also believe that the Crusades were a response to attacks on Christian lands. I don't necessarily believe that everything was done by the Christians was flawed or flawless. There was many flawed, nasty decisions that were made because, even if it was a time for war, that doesn't mean everything was done perfectly. Um, I come from a couple different ethnic backgrounds, but my mother's family comes from Spain. And I can honestly say that the conquistadors forcing Christianity on natives was atrocious. I can say this with a straight face, knowing that my family is one of the original 600 families that came from Spain to populate the area, that would be considered northern Mexico, southern United States at this time in history. That wasn't the map then, but it is now. And the things that my family did were horrible. I can't apologize for them because that wasn't me, but I could acknowledge that what they did was absolutely horrible. Forcing people into Christianity, I don't believe was the right thing to do. And whether Pope Alexander the Sixth gave authorization or not, it was wrong. The church did apologize, but damage was done. Now, I'm not Catholic and that's not my background, but that's the background of my family for generations and generations and generations. So, yes, but I can also say to this person writing this letter that the Christian church has also done some of the most beautiful things for the planet. You can take a list of all the charities in the world, and the vast majority of them are done by people of faith, mostly Christians. They have helped people out of homelessness, poverty, addictions. They have so many organizations that feed the poor. Most of the hospitals that you will go to were founded by Christian religions, and if not, religions in general, because they had the money to create a place for people to find healing in communities. So when you think about what the Christians have done for mankind, it is equally as beautiful as it is atrocious. But if we only focus on the atrocious and don't see the beauty of it, then we're missing the whole picture. And I would say the same thing applies to what this person's trying to get across is that you could show me all the negative things the Christian church did. And, I'm Protestant, where that branched off in history, that's another topic. But because of a lot of the things that the Catholic Church was doing, Martin Luther decided he was going to take a stand, and then we branched off back then. But there's so many beautiful things that even now are done in the name of Jesus. I am privy to so many beautiful things working in churches, working in counseling centers of people that give their time and their energy to go to the gates of hell and help people find their way out. You know, Thinking back on not just on my career, but on career of people I've worked with throughout my time, I could think of ministers who have sacrificed so much of themselves because their heart for people is so huge. And I'm gonna say something maybe antagonistic, but I mean it as challenging maybe, is I don't know very many atheists who are benevolent and kind and good. They all tend to be antagonistic and nasty. And my question to you is, why do we bother you so much? If we're simply these dim-witted idiots who are still, quote unquote, believing in fairy tales, why do we bother you so much? Why can't you just move past it? Why, when you're on social media and you see an advertisement for a podcast about helping people with spiritual warfare, do you have to stop and spend 30 minutes of your life talking about our sky daddy and how stupid we are? Or more importantly, sending nasty, vile, demonic content and then laughing? Why do we bother you so much? If you don't believe that God exists, why did you write this letter? Why did you feel so strongly that you had to correct me in front of my audience? That doesn't make sense. You know who I don't hate? Larry Bananas. You know why I don't hate Larry Bananas? Because I don't know Larry Bananas. I don't think Larry Bananas existed. So if you started talking about Larry Bananas and how great he was, I probably wouldn't entertain you very often, but more importantly, I would go on with my day, and at best, you would get a couple chuckles out of me about how crazy you are for believing in Larry Bananas. But I wouldn't become so irate that I would stop and begin to chastise you, yell at you, demean you for believing in something that I don't believe in. If you wanna know why I believe there's a God, well, I gave you a bunch of definitions. If you wanna know why I believe that my God is the right God, well, I can give you 1,000 definitions and reasons and corroborating evidence, but I think probably one of the biggest forms of evidence is I believe my God is the right God because it's the one you hate. He's the one you hate. You could have easily scrolled past this podcast, but if you listen to it, I can't tell you, intellectually superior, I can't tell you how many podcasts I have started, listened to about 30 minutes because I try to give them a chance because sometimes they start slow and said, "This is not for me." I didn't get mad. I didn't throw my phone out the window. I didn't shut off Spotify, cancel my subscription, and jump off a bridge. I just found something else. I'm not even mad at you. I actually have compassion for you because my faith says that you're not an atheist. You see, if you read your Bible, there's no such thing as atheist, but there are things or people mentioned as God haters. Now, are there true atheists out there who just don't care? They just go through life thinking we're all nuts, just kind of, you know, make a quick chuckle as they walk by and then don't put any thought to it? Maybe so. But you, as an atheist, and I know that because of some of the content I left out, you, as an atheist, hate us. And you shouldn't be able to hate something that's not real. You're not making any sense to me. But I'm going to put a challenge out to you. 5 minutes from now, 5 years from now, 50 years from now, if you ever find yourself struggling and what you believe doesn't make sense and you've lost hope because all of your efforts, all the efforts of what you've believed in are failing you. If I'm still on this podcast or otherwise, seek me out. I'll pray with you. Seek out a church. They'll pray with you because the God I serve loves you and they desire to spend eternity with you. They consider you lost, not a lost cause. My Bible says that my Savior will leave 99 sheep to go find the lost one. And I was one of the lost ones, and I have been found. And my tendencies are to continue to get lost. So my God didn't just leave the 99 one time to go get me. I can't count how many times my God left the 99 to come and get me again. And if this sounds patronizing, I literally don't mean it to be. I genuinely say that there's myself, people in my team, and people listening to this podcast who would say to you that they love you, not because they know you, but because God has taught them to love people. And so I hope these questions help you. And in my selfish, honest way, I've used these questions maybe to help other people as well, help them to understand where we're coming from here. Here's what I know. I know that you wrote this letter because there's something inside of you that's in conflict, or you wouldn't have cared. If we can help you resolve that conflict, fine. If that conflict becomes too loud in your head to deal with, reach out and get some more answers. It might lead you to a place that you never imagined. I'm a pretty smart guy, intellectually superior, but I have never been smart enough to outgrow this God. As a matter of fact, the smarter I get, the more I realize how real God is because I'm too flawed and I need something above me to help me be not only a decent human being, but to get to the afterlife that I seek. Thank you so much for tuning in. I know this was a little heavy and maybe hopefully a lot of education. I want to remind you that you can find us on all of the social medias, Freedom from the Struggle podcast. Twitter, I think, is FFTS podcast, but you can find some other content there. Remember, if you like what we're doing here, like, subscribe, hit the bell, hit the alert so you can get any notifications on new episodes. You want to make sure if you do like some bonus content every now and then, we do have a Patreon campaign, patreon.com/freedom from the struggle. You can find us there. We cover a couple of times a month. We cover lesser known and sometimes well known hauntings or demonic possessions and try to put a spin on them from a deliverance ministry perspective. This Friday, we actually have a pretty interesting episode about a gentleman who was possibly possessed or possibly ill and died from that interactions from exorcism and is a very controversial case. So if you're interested, you can always go to patreon.com. There's a 7-day free trial. You could check out that episode as well as some previous episodes and see if it's something you want to continue. Again, thanks for joining us on the Freedom from the Struggle podcast. We will see you next week. May God grant you a ton of peace and many blessings.